It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon when Sandra Bullock stepped into Le Bijou Prestige, a luxury jewelry boutique nestled in the heart of Beverly Hills. The glass doors glistened under the California sun, and the soft hum of classical music played in the background, setting a serene and elegant atmosphere. But Sandra, despite her fame, felt a pang of discomfort as she walked in. Today, she wasn't a movie star. She was just a woman trying to buy a thoughtful gift for a close friend. She looked around at the sparkling displays of diamonds, rubies, and emeralds, each piece more stunning than the last. It wasn't her first time in a high-end store like this, but there was something about Le Bijou Prestige that made her feel out of place. She brushed off the feeling, determined to find the perfect piece. As she wandered through the store, a sharp voice broke through her thoughts. "Can I help you?" Sandra turned to see a woman standing behind the counter, her eyes sizing her up with an almost predatory gaze. The woman was in her late 30s, impeccably dressed, with sharp features and a cold demeanor. This was Grace, the store manager, who had an air of superiority that immediately made Sandra feel small. "I'm looking for a gift," Sandra said, trying to sound casual, though there was a hint of tension in her voice. "Something special." Grace didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked Sandra up and down, her lips curling into a faint, disapproving smile. "Something special, you say?" she repeated, her tone dripping with condescension. "Well, we do have a wide selection, but I'm not sure if you're quite prepared for our exclusive pieces." Sandra blinked, taken aback. "I'm sure I can handle it," she replied, trying to mask the discomfort building inside her. Grace didn't seem convinced. She motioned toward a display of extravagant, high-end jewelry at the back of the store, clearly implying that Sandra's choice wasn't even worthy of browsing through the front collection. "These," Grace said, "are more suited to someone with refined taste. If you'd prefer something more modest, I can point you to the other section." The dismissive tone hit Sandra like a slap to the face. She could feel her cheeks flush, a sense of anger rising within her, but she held it in. This wasn't the first time someone had judged her based on her public persona. Still, it stung. She wasn't here to play a role. She was just trying to pick out a gift. But this woman, this stranger, had already reduced her to a stereotype. Sandra hesitated for a moment. She could feel the eyes of the other customers in the store on her now. She wasn't just Sandra Bullock. She was the actress, the celebrity, the rich and famous. And to Grace, it seemed, that was all she was ever going to be. Just as she was about to respond, the sound of the door chimes interrupted the tension. Ding, ding! In walked a tall, familiar figure, and immediately, the air in the boutique shifted. Sandra's heart skipped a beat as her eyes locked onto him. Keanu Reeves, Keanu, her close friend, the man who had stood by her through the highs and lows of her career, the man whose calm demeanor and kind heart made him seem like an island of peace in a sea of chaos. The entire atmosphere in the room seemed to freeze. Grace's eyes widened, clearly recognizing the star, but she quickly masked it with her professional smile. Keanu smiled warmly at Sandra and walked over to her, his presence instantly filling the room with an aura of comfort. "Everything okay?" "Here?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm. It wasn't a question, it was more of a statement, an observation of the tension that had been brewing just moments before. Sandra breathed a sigh of relief. She hadn't realized just how uncomfortable she'd been until now. Keanu's calm, reassuring presence made her feel like she could finally exhale. Grace, on the other hand, looked flustered. The effortless charm of Keanu was impossible to ignore, and she couldn't help but feel the weight of his disapproval as he turned his gaze toward her. Sandra took a small step back, letting Keanu handle the situation. She knew him well enough to know that when he spoke, people listened, and right now Grace would have no choice but to listen to him. Keanu didn't even have to say a word. He simply stood beside Sandra, his posture confident and calm, making it clear that he was there to support her. And in that moment, Sandra felt the power of his quiet strength. The humiliation she had been feeling just moments ago began to fade, replaced with a sense of security. For once, she wasn't alone in this. But would Grace realize the weight of the situation before it spiraled further? How does this first chapter feel? Would you like me to continue with the next one, or would you like any adjustments? As Keanu and Sandra stood side by side, the air in Le Bijou Prestige shifted. Grace, now flustered, began to fumble with a few pieces of jewelry on the counter, clearly trying to regain her composure after the unexpected intervention. But Sandra didn't immediately focus on her. Her mind was elsewhere, reflecting on how quickly things had escalated and why it felt so raw. Sandra glanced at Keanu, who was quietly watching the scene unfold, his warm, supportive gaze never leaving her. The years of their friendship, built on a foundation of shared experiences and quiet understanding, filled the silence between them. He didn't need to speak for Sandra to know he was there for her, just as he always had been. As she stood there, feeling the weight of the moment, Sandra couldn't help but reflect on her own journey, the ups and downs of life that led her to this point. Growing up in Arlington, Virginia, Sandra never imagined she would become a Hollywood star. She had always been an ordinary girl, quietly confident in her abilities, yet always second-guessing herself in a world that demanded perfection. Her parents, though supportive, were grounded people who never pushed her into the limelight. But her dreams, those unspoken desires to do something extraordinary, led her to take risks. At 22, she moved to New York, ready to take on the world with nothing but her determination and a modest savings account. It didn't take long for Sandra to realize how cutthroat the entertainment industry could be. The first few years were a blur of auditions, rejections, and minor roles. But then something changed. A role in Speed catapulted her into the spotlight. It was a dream come true. But with the newfound fame came challenges she hadn't anticipated. Every move she made was scrutinized. Every word she said was dissected. She was no longer Sandra from Arlington. She was Sandra Bullock, the actress, the public figure. People wanted her to be a perfect package of talent, beauty, and grace. And when she couldn't meet those unrealistic expectations, she felt the sting of being judged, not for who she was, but for who the world wanted her to be. She thought about how that pressure followed her throughout her career, from The Proposal to Gravity. While the recognition and awards were validating, the isolation was harder to ignore. Her personal life, her relationships, often seemed secondary to the public persona. It was in moments like this, moments of judgment, like the one with Grace, that Sandra's true vulnerability surfaced. She was just a woman trying to navigate a world that often expected her to be something she wasn't. And yet, in the midst of it all, there was Keanu. Sandra met Keanu during the filming of Speed. At first, he seemed like just another co-star, another face in the crowd of Hollywood elite. But over time, she came to realize how different he was from anyone she had ever met. Where others were driven by ambition and fame, Keanu was grounded. He was kind, compassionate, and honest, qualities that seemed to be in short supply in an industry obsessed with image. And unlike many others, Keanu never seemed to see Sandra as anything more than a person. No pretense, no expectations. They quickly became close friends, their bond strengthened by their shared experiences. In many ways, Keanu was her rock. He had seen her at her most vulnerable, when the world around her was too much to bear, and had always been there to remind her of who she truly was. He would often joke that while the world saw her as Sandra Bullock, the actress, to him, she was simply Sandy, a woman who liked to laugh and enjoy the simple things in life, like a good cup of coffee or a quiet walk on the beach. She sighed as she looked at him now. He was still the same, always present, always kind. But even now, as they stood in this boutique, she realized how much she needed his presence. The weight of Grace's words, and the judgment that followed, were heavy. But with Keanu by her side, the world seemed a little more manageable. "Are you all right?" Keanu asked, his voice gentle. Sandra nodded, though she didn't quite feel it. "Yeah, it's hard sometimes, you know. People see you one way, and they think they know everything about you, but they don't. It's like I'm always on display, like I can't just be me." Keanu gave her a small smile. "I know it's a tough thing to navigate, but you know, you're one of the most grounded people I know. You don't let that stuff define you." Sandra met his gaze, feeling a lump in her throat. "It's just hard not to sometimes, especially when people like Grace, people who don't know me, think they can decide who I am. I mean, she barely even gave me the time of day before assuming I was some celebrity stereotype. Keanu's expression softened, his eyes narrowing slightly as if he were thinking about something. He didn't speak right away, choosing his words carefully. People like her don't get it. They'll judge you based on what they think they know, but what matters is what you know about yourself. You've always known your worth. Never let someone else take that from you. Sandra smiled, grateful for his words. They always seemed to come at just the right time. Thanks, Keanu, I needed to hear that. He nodded, his gaze still steady. You don't have to prove anything to anyone. You've already proved everything. That matters. And if you need help with the rest, I've got your back. For the first time since entering the boutique, Sandra felt a sense of calm settle over her. The world outside this little shop seemed a little less daunting. She still had a lot to process. But with Keanu beside her, the journey ahead didn't seem quite so difficult. At that moment, she realized that it wasn't the judgments of people like Grace that defined her. It was her friends. It was Keanu. And most importantly, it was herself. As the two stood there, the tension of the moment slowly dissipated, replaced by a quiet understanding. Sandra was no longer just Sandra Bullock, the actress. She was a woman with depth, with complexity, and with people who truly understood her. And maybe that was enough for today. How did that feel? Let me know if you'd like any adjustments, or if you'd like me to continue with the next chapter. The tension in Bijou Prestige had begun to thaw, but there was still an uneasy undertone in the air. Grace, who had been fidgeting behind the counter, had clearly not expected the situation to shift so quickly. Sandra could see the manager's discomfort, though Grace masked it with an overly polished smile. Keanu stood confidently beside Sandra, his presence commanding yet calm, as if he were an immovable force that grounded them both. Sandra didn't know what had come over her. She wasn't one to rely on anyone else to fight her battles, but with Keanu by her side, everything felt easier. Yet the sting of Grace's condescension still lingered, and Sandra couldn't help but wonder how many times she'd faced this kind of treatment, how many times she'd been underestimated or brushed aside because of her fame. As the seconds ticked by, the awkward silence stretched on. Grace finally spoke, her voice an awkward attempt at returning to professionalism. "So, would you like me to show you our new collection of necklaces?" Grace asked, though the icy edge to her voice was evident. Sandra didn't immediately respond, her gaze flickering to the nearby jewelry display. She'd almost forgotten why she'd come in here in the first place. The mission to buy a thoughtful gift for her friend felt small now, overshadowed by the recent tension and the emotions swirling in her chest. Still, she had to push past it. "I'll take a look, sure," Sandra said, her tone as polite as she could muster despite the frustration gnawing at her. She didn't want to cause a scene, but part of her felt an urge to confront Grace, to call her out for her judgmental behavior. But before she could even take a step forward, Keanu's voice cut through the stillness, his words sharp but quiet, just for Grace to hear. "You know, it's funny," he said, his voice calm but with an undercurrent of something that Sandra couldn't quite place. "You should really be more careful about how you treat people. You never know who you're talking to." Sandra blinked, glancing at Keanu in surprise. She hadn't expected him to speak so directly, so pointedly. But as she looked at Grace, she saw her posture stiffen, her professional smile faltering for just a moment. Grace's eyes widened in recognition as she took a step back, clearly realizing that Keanu wasn't just another customer. "Mr. Reeves," Grace stammered, her tone shifting from cold to more deferential. "I didn't realize. I'm sorry. If I—" Keanu didn't let her finish. He stepped closer, his expression neutral, though there was a definite firmness in his voice now. "No need to apologize," Keanu said smoothly. "But maybe next time you should remember that everyone deserves respect, no matter who they are or where they come from." The words hung in the air like a weight, and for a moment, Sandra thought Grace might say something more. But instead, Grace simply nodded, her face flushed with embarrassment. It was clear that the humiliation she felt in that moment was something Grace had never experienced before. In the world of high-end retail, where appearances were everything, the idea of publicly being put in her place by someone like Keanu Reeves was more than she could handle. Sandra watched the exchange with a mix of emotions. She appreciated Keanu stepping in, but she also realized that this wouldn't be the last time she'd encounter people who would judge her based on her fame or her appearance. This was just another example of the double-edged sword that came with being in the public eye. As Grace quickly turned her attention back to the display case, Keanu leaned slightly closer to Sandra, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You don't have to take that from her," he murmured. "No one should ever make you feel small." Sandra gave him a small smile, grateful for his quiet support. She hadn't realized how much she needed to hear those words until now. The whole situation, from the judgment to the awkwardness, had been too much, and yet, in that moment, she felt a weight lifted. "I know," Sandra replied softly, her eyes meeting his. "I just wish I didn't have to deal with this kind of thing all the time." Keanu nodded, understanding. "It's not easy, but you've got this. You always do." Sandra looked at him, truly seeing the depth of their friendship. Keanu wasn't just her friend. He was someone who understood her in ways few others did. He had seen her at her highest and lowest points, and he never wavered in his support. That was more than she could say for most people. They stood there for a few more moments, both silently observing Grace as she nervously fidgeted with the jewelry, clearly wanting to move on from the uncomfortable exchange. But Sandra's thoughts drifted back to the real issue at hand. The judgment she faced, the assumptions people made about her, and the constant battle of proving herself worthy, not as an actress, but simply as a human being. Finally, she took a deep breath, ready to move past the awkwardness and focus on why she was here. "You know what?" Sandra said, breaking the silence. "Let's pick something out, Keanu. I came here for a reason, and I'm not going to let this ruin it." Keanu smiled warmly at her, his eyes full of admiration. "That's the spirit." Sandra turned back to the jewelry display, forcing herself to focus on the task at hand. But deep down she knew that it wasn't just about the gift she was buying. It was about reclaiming her power, her sense of self. And with Keanu by her side, she knew she could do just that. How does this feel? Would you like me to continue with the next chapter, or do you want any adjustments? The air in Bijou Prestige still felt thick with tension, but Sandra pushed through it. She was determined to focus on the task at hand, to pick out the perfect gift for her friend. She didn't want to let the condescending attitude of Grace or the awkwardness of the moment ruin her day. It was just a piece of jewelry, after all. A gesture, a thoughtful token of appreciation. But it meant something to Sandra. She had never been one to indulge in materialism, not even with the money and fame that came from being one of Hollywood's most bankable stars. Still, she knew how much small things, meaningful gifts, could touch someone's heart. She thought of her friend, the one who had always been there when the cameras were off, when the world wasn't watching. Sandra's fingers grazed the smooth glass case as she carefully examined each piece. They were breathtakingly beautiful, all meticulously crafted. Diamonds sparkled in their settings, rubies shimmered in rich reds, and emeralds glowed with an alluring green hue. But it wasn't just the price tags or the rarity of the stones that made these pieces stand out. It was the stories they could tell. Every piece seemed to carry a hidden history, a mystery waiting to be unearthed. Keanu stood by her side, quiet but ever present, his eyes scanning the room. He could sense that this wasn't just about choosing a gift. This was an act of reclaiming something deeper. Sandra had never been one to openly admit it, but he knew that moments like this, when she was forced to deal with people's judgments, tugged at her in ways most would never understand. The superficiality of it all, the way people saw her and placed her in a box, sometimes drained her. After a moment of silence, Sandra turned to Keanu, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's silly, isn't it? How something as simple as a gift can feel so complicated." Keanu met her gaze, his expression gentle. "It's not silly, it's important. Sometimes it's the small things that carry the most weight." Sandra nodded, taking a deep breath. She could feel the frustration melting away with each passing second. She wasn't just Sandra Bullock, the actress, in this moment. She was just someone trying to do something nice for a friend, someone trying to make a difference in her own quiet way. As she continued to study the pieces, One caught her eye, a delicate necklace with a pendant shaped like a leaf. It was subtle, but striking, elegant but understated. It felt just right, perfect for her friend. She smiled, knowing this was the one. "That one," Sandra said softly, pointing to the necklace. Keanu glanced at the piece and then back at her, a slight smile tugging at his lips. "Good choice." Sandra turned to Grace, who had been standing in the background, clearly trying to regain her composure after the earlier exchange. She wasn't sure how to feel about Grace's sudden shift in demeanor. The coldness had dissolved, but now there was an unsettling politeness. It was as if the balance of power had shifted, and Grace was doing her best to maintain control. With a faint but noticeable edge to her voice, Grace said, "I'll prepare that for you immediately. It's one of our finest pieces." As Grace walked away to retrieve the necklace, Sandra couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this moment than just jewelry. It was a reminder of how much she had been judged by people she barely knew. How many times had she faced this same judgment in her career? How many times had she walked into a room, a store, or a meeting, only to be met with assumptions about who she was based on the surface? Keanu seemed to sense her quiet contemplation. He spoke softly. "You're not defined by what people think of you, Sandra. You know that, right?" Sandra looked at him, her heart warming at the sincerity in his words. She nodded, though the doubt in her mind was harder to silence. "I know. But sometimes it's harder to remember than others." Keanu smiled, his eyes kind but knowing. "I get it. But every time you're faced with that judgment, you have a choice. You can either let it define you or let it go. And every time you let it go—" Sandra smiled, feeling a bit lighter. There was truth in his words. It wasn't easy. It was never easy. But Keanu had always been there, offering that quiet, steady support. Grace returned a moment later with the necklace in hand, her professional mask back in place. She opened the case, revealing the leaf-shaped pendant, its diamonds catching the light with an ethereal glow. "There you go," Grace said, her voice almost too sweet now. "A truly exquisite piece. I'm sure your friend will love it." Sandra smiled, but it wasn't the smile of someone who was grateful. It was a smile of someone who had learned to navigate the tricky terrain of human interaction, to recognize when something was genuine and when it was just a performance. "Thank you," Sandra said, her voice steady. "I'll take it." As Grace carefully boxed up the necklace and wrapped it in a delicate ribbon, Sandra felt her thoughts turning inward again. She realized how much she had grown over the years. The pressure of fame, the constant judgment, the endless assumptions, it still got to her sometimes. But she was learning how to reclaim her own power, how to stand firm in who she was, even in the face of adversity. Keanu's quiet presence reminded her of that strength. In a world where so much was based on appearances, where so many people were judged for things they couldn't control, Keanu had always been a reminder that the most important thing was to stay true to oneself. As they left the boutique together, Sandra felt something shift inside her. It wasn't a grand epiphany or some life-changing realization, but it was enough. She had faced a small battle that day, not against a person, but against her own insecurities, and she had come out the other side stronger. What do you think of this chapter? Would you like me to continue with the next one or make any changes? The ride back to Sandra's house was quiet, the kind of silence that spoke volumes. The outside world seemed to melt away, leaving the two of them cocooned in the luxury of Keanu's company. Despite the momentary victory of choosing the necklace and putting Grace in her place, Sandra felt a strange weight pressing down on her chest. It wasn't just about the awkward encounter at the store anymore. It was something deeper, something she couldn't quite put into words. Keanu, ever perceptive, noticed the shift in Sandra's demeanor. His gaze remained focused on the road, but there was a quiet understanding in his eyes. He didn't need to ask. He simply knew that something wasn't sitting right with her. "You okay?" Keanu asked, his voice low and steady, as though he were testing the waters, waiting for her to let her guard down. Sandra hesitated before answering. The words felt like they might crack under the pressure of everything she had been feeling for weeks. But she knew Keanu was the one person who wouldn't judge her, the one person who could truly see through the facade she so often had to put on. "It's just all of it, you know," Sandra said, her voice soft but tinged with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "The judgment, the way people look at you. It's exhausting. Some days it feels like I'm not even me anymore, like I'm just a character they've made up in their heads." Keanu's hand moved to the gear shift, but his mind was far away, processing her words. His response was quiet, but it cut straight to the heart of what Sandra was feeling. "People are always going to project their ideas onto you," he said. "But that doesn't mean it's who you are. You've spent your whole life being more than what others see. And sometimes it's hard to fight that. But you are more than the roles you've played, more than the fame. You're still you." Sandra swallowed hard, the weight of his words sinking in. She had spent so much time trying to live up to others' expectations, trying to be the version of herself that everyone wanted her to be. But in doing so, she had lost pieces of herself along the way. Pieces she was only now starting to reclaim. "I just want to be normal," she admitted, her voice trembling. "To be seen for who I really am, not just for the roles I've played or the awards I've won." "It's hard, Keanu. It's like I'm always performing even when the cameras aren't rolling." Keanu's gaze softened, and he reached over, placing a hand on her arm in a gesture of silent solidarity. He knew this wasn't something Sandra could just turn off, not something that could be solved with a few kind words. The battle she was fighting was internal, and it was exhausting. "You don't have to carry that weight alone, Sandra," Keanu said quietly. "I see you, and I know who you are. You're more than enough, just as you are." A lump formed in Sandra's throat, and she felt a tear slip down her cheek unbidden. It wasn't out of weakness, it was out of relief. For so long she had been holding everything in, wearing a mask that only seemed to get heavier with each passing day. But here, with Keanu by her side, she didn't have to pretend. She didn't have to be anything other than what she was. They didn't speak again until they arrived at Sandra's house. When Keanu pulled into the driveway, he parked the car and turned off the engine, the hum of the car's motor fading into the stillness of the night. Sandra sat there for a moment, her mind swirling, trying to make sense of everything that had just been said, everything she had been feeling. Keanu stayed silent beside her, waiting for her to gather her thoughts. He didn't rush her, knowing that sometimes silence was the best way to allow someone to process. Finally, Sandra turned to him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." Keanu gave her a small smile, his eyes kind and full of understanding. "You don't need to. Thank me. I'm always here, you know that." Sandra nodded, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. It wasn't just his words, it was his presence. His unwavering support had always been there, even when the world felt like it was spinning out of control. And right now, that was more than enough. As she stepped out of the car and headed toward her front door, Sandra felt something shift inside her. The emotional roller coaster of the past few hours, the discomfort at the jewelry store, the frustrations of living under constant scrutiny had left her feeling vulnerable, but it had also given her clarity. She didn't have to be defined by the judgments of others. She was more than her fame, more than her image. She was Sandra, a woman trying to make the best of the life she had, despite the pressures that came with it. And with that realization, she walked into her house, leaving the lingering weight of the day behind. The sun was beginning to set as Sandra stood in the living room, the soft golden light spilling through the large windows. She hadn't been able to shake the conversation with Keanu, and the more she thought about it, the more she realized how deeply it had affected her. For years, she had pushed down her feelings, the weight of her public persona and the constant scrutiny. But today, something had changed. She felt a shift within herself, like a fog lifting, revealing a path she had been too afraid to walk before. Her gaze drifted to the box on the coffee table, the necklace from Bijou Prestige. It sat there, wrapped in its delicate tissue paper and ribbon, a beautiful reminder of the act of kindness she had been able to do for her friend. Yet the necklace had become more than just a gift. It had become a symbol of the way she was beginning to see herself again, beyond the cameras, beyond the roles, and beyond the endless expectations of the world around her. Sandra sat down on the couch, her fingers lightly grazing the box. She thought about everything she had been through, the judgment, the loneliness, the constant battle of being seen for who she truly was. But more than anything, she thought about Keanu, about how, without saying much, he had always known what she needed, how he had seen her in ways that no one else had, and how he never made her feel less than. Keanu had been her anchor, her rock, in ways she hadn't fully understood until now. He hadn't just given her support, he had reminded her of her worth. And in doing so, he had given her something even more important, the courage to stop running from herself. With a deep breath, Sandra reached for the box and slowly unwrapped it, revealing the necklace. The leaf-shaped pendant sparkled in the dim light, its diamonds reflecting a soft, ethereal glow. It was everything she had imagined, simple, elegant, and timeless. It was a piece that not only looked beautiful, but felt like it held meaning, like it belonged in the world of kindness and understanding that Keanu had shown her. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, and she picked it up, finding a message from Keanu. She smiled, knowing it was something simple, like a check-in or a joke. But when she opened the text, she read the words that made her heart swell. Keanu, no matter what the world sees, remember this. You are always enough. Always. And I'm proud of you. Talk soon. Sandra felt a tear slip down her cheek, not out of sadness, but because for the first time in a long time, she felt understood. It wasn't about the fame or the accolades. It wasn't about how many people knew her name. It was about being seen for who she truly was, the woman behind the fame, the woman who had dreams, insecurities, and struggles just like everyone else. And Keanu was the one person who truly got it. She typed a quick reply, her fingers hovering over the keyboard for a moment before she hit send. Sandra, thank you. You have no idea how much your words mean to me. She set the phone down and looked out the window, the golden light of the sunset casting a peaceful glow over everything. She realized that while she would always face challenges, people who judged, her assumptions made about her, and the weight of fame, she didn't have to let it define her. She could choose to be true to herself, to walk her own path, and to surround herself with people who saw her for who she really was. The truth was, she had always known who she was. She just needed someone to remind her. The quiet hum of the world outside her windows seemed comforting now, a reminder that she had her own space in it, a place where she could grow, heal, and continue her journey on her own terms. The necklace, now resting on the table beside her, was just the beginning, a symbol of how far she had come and how far she still had to go. But the journey didn't feel as lonely anymore. Her phone buzzed again and Sandra picked it up, half expecting another message from Keanu. Instead, it was from her friend, the one she had bought the necklace for. Friend, I just wanted to thank you for such a thoughtful gift. You're always so kind, Sandra. I don't think you'll ever know how much that means to me. Sandra smiled softly. The gesture she had made, however small, had already begun to impact someone else in a way she hadn't expected. And that was the kind of thing that mattered. It wasn't about being perfect or meeting the world's expectations. It was about the quiet moments of kindness, the ways she could make a difference in the lives of those she cared about. As she read her friend's message, Sandra realized that this was her new goal. It wasn't about perfection or about fighting every battle that came her way. It was about finding peace within herself, embracing her imperfections, and allowing the kindness she had always shown to others to be the guiding force in her own life. Sandra stood up, her heart light, and walked over to the window. She looked out at the city, watching the last of the sunlight fade behind the horizon. For the first time in a long while, she felt at peace. The road ahead wasn't always going to be easy, but she had the strength to walk it. She wasn't just Sandra Bullock, the actress. She was Sandra, the woman who had learned to embrace herself, imperfections and all. The days following Sandra's reflection felt quieter, more grounded. She had found a peace within herself that hadn't existed before, one that allowed her to see the world with fresh eyes. And even though life would always have its ups and downs, it no longer felt like she was merely a pawn in the game of public opinion. She had control over her own narrative, and that was worth more than anything the world could offer her. It was a Sunday afternoon when Sandra received an unexpected call. The number was unfamiliar, but something about the way it buzzed on her phone made her instinctively answer it. "Hello?" Sandra's voice was tentative, but she was curious. "Hey, Sandra, it's me, Keanu." His voice was warm, that familiar kindness radiating through the line. "Keanu, I didn't expect to hear from you. How are you?" she asked, smiling, even though he couldn't see it. "I'm good, just checking in. I wanted to ask you something. We've been talking a lot about the pressure of fame and judgment, right?" Keanu's voice was thoughtful, measured. Sandra chuckled softly. "I think we've had about 1,000,000 conversations on that topic already." Keanu laughed too, the sound light and genuine. "Yeah, it seems like it's been the theme of the week. But here's the thing. I've been thinking about all the people out there who don't have anyone to remind them that they're enough, who don't have someone who truly gets it." Sandra raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Okay, I'm following you. But what's the idea?" "Well," he continued, "you're one of the few people I know who can truly make a difference just by showing up. What if we did something together? Not for the cameras, not for the world's approval, just something real, something that could make someone's day a little brighter. What do you think?" Sandra leaned back on the couch, her mind racing with possibilities. She had thought a lot about how she could contribute to something greater than herself, something more meaningful than just her career or the next big project. This felt like an opportunity to do just that. "I love that idea," Sandra said, her voice filled with enthusiasm. "But what do you have in mind?" "Well, I know this organization that helps support at-risk youth, people who don't have the same opportunities that we do. They could use a little light, a little hope right now. And I know your presence, your support, would mean the world to them," Keanu said earnestly. "We don't have to make a big deal about it. Just show up, give them something to hold on to, something real." Sandra's heart warmed at the thought. This was exactly the kind of thing she had been craving, an opportunity to connect with people in a meaningful way, without the expectations of the world on her shoulders. "I'm in," Sandra said, her voice firm with resolve. "Let's do." The conversation continued, the two of them brainstorming ways they could surprise the kids, how they could bring a little light into their lives. It wasn't going to be about gifts or grand gestures. It was going to be about being present, showing up for people who needed to see that they mattered. And for Sandra, it was an opportunity to prove to herself once again that she could make a difference, not because of who she was on a screen, but because of who she was at her core. As the conversation ended and Sandra hung up the phone, she felt a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced in a long time. It was like a weight had lifted from her shoulders, not because everything was suddenly perfect, but because she was doing something that mattered. For the first time, she wasn't concerned with her public image or the judgments of others. She was concerned with the real, tangible impact she could have on the world, the kind of impact that came from the heart. Later that week, Sandra and Keanu made their way to the community center, where they had arranged to meet the kids. The air was crisp with the early evening chill, but Sandra could feel an excitement bubbling within her. This wasn't about performing or pretending to be someone she wasn't. This was about being genuine, something she had struggled to do for so long. When they arrived, a group of young people stood outside waiting for them. Sandra could see the hesitation in their eyes, the uncertainty that came with meeting someone like her. But she also saw something else, the spark of hope. Just by being there, she was already making a difference. Keanu smiled and walked toward the group, his relaxed demeanor putting everyone at ease. Sandra followed him, her heart swelling with emotion. The kids were shy at first, but as the conversation started, the walls began to fall. They spoke about their dreams, their struggles, and what they hoped for in the future. Sandra shared her own experiences with them, talking about the pressures of fame, but also about the things that really mattered, the importance of being true to yourself, of giving back, and of not letting the world define you. She spoke not as a celebrity, but as a woman who had been through the highs and lows of life, and who had learned that the true measure of success was how you made others feel. The evening flew by filled with laughter and connection. Sandra and Keanu didn't leave with any grand promises or flashy gifts. They left with something far more valuable: the knowledge that they had made a difference in the lives of the people who needed it most. As Sandra climbed back into the car, her heart full, Keanu glanced over at her, a grin spreading across his face. "That was something, huh?" Sandra nodded, feeling a profound sense of gratitude. "It was. Thank you, Keanu, for reminding me that I can make a difference, not just by being someone the world knows, but by simply being myself." Keanu smiled, his eyes soft. "You don't need to thank me. You've always known that. It just took you a while to see it." Sandra smiled, her thoughts full of the young faces she had met that evening. She had learned something important, something that would stay with her forever. She didn't need to be perfect or live up to anyone's expectations. She just needed to show up, and that was enough. Sandra woke up the next morning feeling lighter than she had in months. The sense of fulfillment from the evening before lingered, and she found herself looking forward to more days like that one. But as the day went on, a realization started to dawn on her, one that made the weight of everything she had gone through over the years feel even heavier. She had taken small steps toward reclaiming her own happiness, but there was still so much to process. She had spent so long trying to live up to others' expectations, playing the roles that the world handed to her. But now, the pressure of constantly living up to a certain image, whether through social media, the public eye, or even the expectations from those closest to her, was beginning to feel like an impossible weight. She picked up her phone and scrolled through the messages waiting for her. Most of them were light-hearted or routine, texts from friends, fans, and business contacts, but one message caught her eye. It was from her manager. "Manager, Sandra, can we talk later today? There's an important project coming your way. Let me know when you have time." Sandra frowned as she read the message. Her initial reaction was one of hesitation. She didn't want to jump back into the grind of being in the spotlight. She had just started to carve out time for herself, to focus on what truly mattered. But a part of her knew she couldn't just walk away from the industry completely. Her career, her livelihood, was built on these opportunities, and she knew the expectations wouldn't stop just because she wanted them to. She set the phone down and looked out the window, her mind racing, with conflicting thoughts. The desire to take control of her own narrative and live a quieter, more meaningful life was so strong. But the pressure to keep performing, to keep achieving, was always just a whisper in the back of her mind. Later that afternoon, she met with Keanu for coffee. They sat in a cozy corner of her favorite cafe, the smell of freshly brewed coffee mixing with the rich, warm atmosphere of the place. Keanu seemed to sense that something was on her mind immediately. "What's going on?" he asked, leaning forward slightly, his expression gentle but concerned. Sandra took a deep breath and looked him in the eye. "I got a message from my manager about a new project, and honestly, I don't know what to do about it. I mean, I want to say no, but I also feel like I can't. It's a job, it's what I do, right? But the thought of jumping back into the grind, it feels like it's going to take everything I've just started to build up, my peace, my space." Keanu nodded thoughtfully, understanding the turmoil Sandra was experiencing. "It sounds like you're caught between two worlds, the one where you're following your own needs, your own happiness, and the one where you're constantly being pulled back into the business." Sandra sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Exactly. It's not that I don't love acting. It's just that I feel like every decision I make now, every step I take, has to be in line with who I really am. And I'm scared of falling back into old patterns, of being that person who's always chasing the next thing, always performing for the audience, and losing myself in the process." Keanu studied her for a moment, his eyes steady, reflecting a wisdom that came from his own journey. "You've already made so much progress, Sandra, but I think the key is balance. You don't have to throw everything away. You don't have to be all in or all out. You're allowed to step into the things that bring you joy, but you're also allowed to say no to what doesn't feel right anymore." Sandra's heart lightened as she listened to him. The pressure she had been feeling began to ease. She wasn't expected to give everything up. She could simply choose what she truly wanted. She didn't have to let anyone else dictate the terms of her life. She had the power to navigate this next chapter, and it was okay to take it one step at a time. "I think you're right," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. "I don't have to let fear control my decisions. I don't have to be afraid of saying no to the things that don't feel right, even if they come in the form of big projects or expectations. I can do things on my own terms, in my own time." Keanu gave her a reassuring smile, and the two of them sat in companionable silence for a few moments, letting the weight of the conversation settle. Then Keanu broke the silence with a playful grin. "And hey, if you ever need someone to tell your manager to back off, I'm happy to help. I'm pretty good at saying no for people." Sandra laughed, feeling lighter than she had all day. "I might just take you up on that," she teased, grateful for his presence. As they wrapped up their coffee and stepped outside, Sandra felt like a small weight had been lifted. It wasn't just about turning down a project. It was about reclaiming her space and her voice. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she had the control to choose how she wanted to show up in the world, without the expectations of others hanging over her. That evening, Sandra made the decision to call her manager back. She would politely decline the project. She knew it wasn't the right time. It was important to listen to her intuition and trust that taking a step back would allow her to move forward with clarity and purpose. She wasn't just taking control of her career. She was taking control of her life. The next few days passed by in a blur for Sandra. Her decision to step away from the project had been empowering, but the after-effects weren't always as clear-cut as she had hoped. There were moments when she felt confident, like she was on the right path, reclaiming her peace and sense of self. But there were also moments when doubt crept in, when she wondered if stepping away from the spotlight would eventually isolate her, if it would prevent her from doing what she loved. Still, she had Keanu's words echoing in her mind. He had reminded her that there was strength in setting boundaries, and that the right path was the one that made her feel whole, not just the one that others expected of her. It wasn't about rejecting her career. It was about finding balance between her passions and her well-being. One afternoon, as Sandra was preparing to go out for a walk, her phone buzzed with a text from her friend, a journalist who had recently started writing for a popular magazine. The message immediately caught her attention. It wasn't typical for her friend to reach out unless there was something newsworthy happening. "Friend, Sandra, I hope you're doing well. I wanted to give you a heads up about something. There's a story coming out about Bijou Prestige, the jewelry store where you had that incident. Apparently they're looking to clear the air about their employees' behavior. You might want to be prepared for the fallout. The story's getting a lot of attention. Just wanted to give you a warning." Sandra's heart sank as she read the message. She had hoped that the drama surrounding her visit to the boutique was behind her. After all, she had moved past the humiliation, embracing the kindness Keanu had shown her and finding peace in her own growth. But this was something she wasn't expecting. She sat down on the edge of the bed, feeling the weight of the situation settle over her. She had already faced the public's judgment when the incident first happened, but the idea of it resurfacing, especially in the context of a story meant to clear the air, made her stomach churn. Would this turn into another media circus? Would the story be twisted again, made to look like something it wasn't? Her mind started to race with questions, but she knew she needed to take control of the situation. She couldn't allow herself to be blindsided by rumors or half-truths. Not again. She stood up, grabbed her phone, and immediately dialed Keanu's number. "Hey, it's Sandra," she said when he picked up. "I need to talk." There was a moment of silence before Keanu's calm voice answered, "What's going on?" Sandra quickly explained the situation, detailing the message from her friend and the impending story about Bijou Prestige. She could feel her anxiety creeping up, but Keanu's steady presence on the other end of the line helped to calm her nerves. "First of all, don't let this throw you off balance," Keanu said, his tone reassuring. "You've been through so much already, and this isn't going to define you. If anything, this is just another chance to show your strength. You've always handled yourself with grace under pressure." Sandra took a deep breath. "But what if the story is twisted again? What if they try to make me look bad? I don't want to go through that again." Keanu was quiet for a moment, letting her words sink in. Then he said something that caught her off guard. Maybe this time, instead of waiting for the story to be told by someone else, you tell it yourself. You control the narrative. You don't need to wait for the world to decide how they see you. You've already shown that you can rise above. But what if this is your chance to set the record straight, on your own terms? Sandra was taken aback. It hadn't occurred to her that she could take control of the situation in this way. She had spent so much time reacting to what others said about her, never quite feeling like she had the power to speak her truth. "Do you mean a statement? A public response?" she asked. Keanu nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "Exactly. A statement from you. It doesn't need to be anything long or dramatic. Just a simple, honest message about how you've grown from the experience, about the importance of kindness, and about how everyone deserves to be treated with respect." Sandra felt her pulse quicken as she thought about it. This could be her opportunity to not only clear her name, but also to shift the focus of the story, to take the power away from the boutique's employee and refocus it on the lessons she had learned. This wasn't just about the boutique incident. This was about standing up for herself and her values. "Okay," she said, a new sense of determination filling her voice. "I'll do it. I'll write the statement." The two of them discussed the best way to approach it, Keanu giving her a few pointers, but ultimately leaving the tone and message in her hands. It was time for Sandra to own her story. Later that evening, she sat down at her desk, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. The words came more easily than she had anticipated, as if they had been waiting for this moment to be released. She wasn't writing for anyone but herself, but she knew that sharing her truth might help others who had been through similar experiences. When she finished, she read through the statement one last time. It felt right. It felt real. And with a deep breath, she sent it to her team for approval. Sandra's statement. "Several months ago, I had an experience that caused me a great deal of frustration and embarrassment. I was humiliated in a situation that, frankly, should have never occurred. But I've come to understand that how we handle difficult situations is just as important as how we are treated by others. The experience at Bijou Prestige made me realize that kindness, respect, and empathy are the true foundations of our interactions with one another. I have grown since that moment, and I am grateful for the opportunity to learn from it. We all make mistakes, but it is how we move forward that defines us. I hope this story serves as a reminder to all of us to approach each other with understanding, to see the humanity in each person, and to always act with kindness, no matter the situation." Sandra felt a sense of peace as she hit send. She had done it. She had taken control of her own narrative, and for the first time in a long time, she felt truly empowered. The next morning, Sandra awoke to a mix of anticipation and nervous energy. Her statement had been published, and the media buzz was immediate. Her phone was buzzing constantly with calls, texts, and notifications, but unlike the previous times when news of her personal life had spread like wildfire, today felt different. She didn't feel powerless. She didn't feel like she was on the defensive. For the first time in a long time, Sandra was the one telling her story, controlling the narrative, and owning her own truth. Keanu had been the first person she'd called after sending out the statement, and he was the one she reached out to again that morning. She didn't know what kind of fallout there would be, but she felt strangely calm, knowing she had the support of someone who truly understood her. "Morning," Keanu answered, his voice warm. "I saw the statement. That was powerful. How are you? Feeling about it?" Sandra smiled softly as she sipped her coffee. "I feel good. It's not just about what happened in the jewelry store. It's about the bigger picture, about choosing to take control of my life instead of letting things happen. To me, it feels liberating." Keanu chuckled lightly. "It's amazing how much power there is in sharing your truth. I'm proud of you, Sandra. That was a bold move." Sandra looked out of the window, watching as the city slowly came to life. She felt a sense of calm that she hadn't experienced in years. The spotlight didn't have to be a source of anxiety anymore. She had learned to redefine it on her own terms, to turn it into something that felt empowering instead of overwhelming. As the day went on, the media outlets started reporting on her statement. Surprisingly, the response was overwhelmingly positive. Fans and critics alike praised Sandra for her vulnerability, her honesty, and her ability to rise above the challenges she had faced. Instead of the drama overshadowing her career, Sandra's decision to speak out became a defining moment in her journey. It was clear that the public appreciated the strength she had shown, but Sandra knew that her journey wasn't over. This was just one chapter in a much larger story, her story. And for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of what the next chapter would bring. A few hours later, she received a call from her manager. She hesitated for a moment before answering. She had made the decision to step back from certain projects, but she knew she couldn't avoid this conversation forever. "Sandra, I've been following everything that's been happening, and I just wanted to say I'm really proud of you," her manager said, the tone sincere. "You handled everything with grace, and you've made such a positive impact. We've been talking about some upcoming opportunities, and I think it's time we start thinking about the next steps in your career. But this time, we'll make sure it's the right fit for you." Sandra took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. It was an opportunity to step into a new phase of her career, one that was in line with the person she had become, rather than the person she had been expected to be. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady. "I appreciate the support, but I'm not interested in just any project. I want something meaningful, something that aligns with where I am in my life now. I don't want to be part of the machine anymore. I want to do work that feels authentic, that has purpose." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Sandra could almost hear her manager nodding in understanding. "I get it, and we'll make sure we find something that reflects that. Let's take our time with this. We'll find the right opportunity." Sandra smiled to herself, feeling a sense of relief wash over her. She had just taken another step toward living life on her own terms, and while it wasn't always easy, it felt right. Later that evening, Sandra received a surprise invitation. It was from Keanu. He had planned a small dinner with close friends to celebrate her decision to take control of her life. She had been hesitant to go out and socialize so soon after everything that had happened, but Keanu's words had stuck with her. This was her time to live for herself, and she didn't have to hide from the world. The dinner was warm and intimate. Surrounded by people who genuinely cared about her, Sandra felt a sense of belonging. Keanu's presence was a steadying force, and his quiet support made her feel like she wasn't alone in this new phase of her life. As the evening wound down, Keanu raised his glass for a toast. "To Sandra," he said, his voice full of admiration. "For having the courage to rewrite your own story. You've always had the power to shine, you just needed to remember that." Sandra felt a surge of emotion as she clinked her glass with his. "Thank you, Keanu, for everything, for showing me what it means to be authentic, to be kind, and to stand up for myself." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of laughter and light conversation, but Sandra couldn't shake the sense of fulfillment that filled her heart. She had come so far, and she knew the road ahead would be filled with challenges, but she was ready. For the first time in years, Sandra Bullock was truly living her life on her own terms. She had reclaimed the spotlight, not because of fame, not because of what others expected, but because she had finally learned how to shine from within. As she said her goodbyes and stepped out into the cool night air, Sandra felt lighter than she ever had before. Her journey wasn't just about overcoming the past, it was about embracing the future, whatever that future held. Thank you for following Sandra's journey. I hope this conclusion resonates with you. Would you like to make any revisions, or is there something else you'd like to add?